Okay, hey folks. My name is Ann Cole with Real Hens of OC, and this is Lynn Fang. You want to
Hi,
introduce yourself?
I'm Lynn Fang. I have a business called Soilwise, and we do ecological landscaping and soil health consulting and education work. And I also work for LA Compost and various other community organizations.
So, unfortunately, Ashley, who planned this with us, Ashley from Heirloom Potager, couldn't be here today at the last minute. But we're going to continue. With the whole point of this is we wanted to do a more casual discussion with Lynn and me and Ashley, and she had a client who had questions about gardening and what to do, from the ash fallout from the LA fires. And yes, it's been a month after that, but I just think with climate change and the history of events, it's going to happen again, unfortunately. So we were getting a lot of questions from like our clients, people that we talk to in our communities that grow food and who care about like the soil health, on what to do with our gardens and produce and soil, and how we might be able to ameliorate or remediate a lot of the problems. And Lynn is super important because she's a soil expert. And I think the biggest question is like, how have, she and I talked about, can you tell everyone like, how have the fires affected some of the soils based on the stuff that you have studied in the different areas so far?
Yeah, I was looking at some of the research from previous urban wildfires, and there's a lot of concern because of structures burning, that the materials that they're made out of can be very damaging to our health. Things like heavy metals like lead, things like asbestos, things like gasoline like in our vehicles, and plastics as well, like PVC is used in so many of our irrigation systems and our landscapes. And so just had learned a lot about like the types of toxins that these materials produce, like when they're burned. So yeah, we like the other kind of studies show like elevated heavy metals. There was ash testing done in Lahaina that showed like really alarmingly high levels of heavy metals. And other studies show, that there's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are released.
What are those?
They're called PAHs. So those occur naturally in like coal, crude oil, gasoline, and then they're also released when those materials are burned. They also come from burning of wood in our everyday things too, like cigarettes, but also trash. So all of these things would get burned in an urban wildfire. But that is probably more immediate release and it would dissipate. Some of them might stick around, but they should dissipate more quickly. The other things are the asbestos release. So asbestos is actually like a natural mineral, and it doesn't decompose, and it's like tiny little fibers. So the what you're afraid of is that if you breathe those fibers in, they could get stuck in your lungs and contribute to cancer in the long term. And they actually tried to phase it out of use in the 1970s, but people were still using it in construction projects. So if there's like really historic homes, they probably have asbestos in them. And when they could be dangerous is like when you're installing it or demoing a property, or if it's like out in the soil and you're like digging it up, then it could come into the air and cause a problem. Some of the other ones are like PFAS, which stands for like per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and these are honestly used everywhere. They're in our like the coffee cups, like the liners or to-go containers. They're used because they're water and grease resistant, and they're also used in firefighting foams, and they're used in like carpets and upholstery, all sorts of everyday things, and they don't degrade very easily, and they're very mobile. They move through our water, soil, through plants and animals, through our bodies. So that long-term accumulation can cause chronic health problems. It's also the main thing in Teflon, so
Right.
a lot of people use Teflon.
And I understand they're like some sort of endocrine disruptors in your body system, so it
Yeah.
can cause a lot of problems, right?
Yeah. So they're endocrine disruptor. A lot of these things are like disrupting your like endocrine, your neurological systems, or your like liver and kidney systems, or they could cause cancer. So that's the concern around these contaminants. There's another one that's called dioxins and furans, and that comes from burning of trash and PVC and plastics. So all of these are contributing to potential like chronic health effects.
So, thank you. I think in Southern California, we're very urban, right? Even those of us like me who live in the suburbs, it's still very urban. I mean, there's a street right behind my house. So I think the concern has always been when you're urban gardening, there's going to be maybe some sort of toxins or heavy metals in our soil anyway, from like off-gassing and cars passing by and all that. So how much more, I guess the question that people usually have is for after this is like, can those contribute to the soil health? And there is concern about we're getting more and more information for some of the agencies and cities and authorities that are doing some of the testing that you've been working with as well. But like, I think for a lot of people, because of the length of the tests and how long they are, length of time to do some of these tests, some of these tests can be like pretty cost prohibitive for a lot of people. And I think there's also an issue with, yes, you can get your soil tested, but as a layperson, we don't really have the background or knowledge to be able to interpret and understand some of these tests. So I think this is part of why we want to kind of have this discussion. So have you talked to folks or have any input on how these things in our soil might have increased in addition to, like, are you able to separate like what's already existing and what's new?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is, of course, like, we're using all these materials in our environment. So there's pre-existing levels of contaminants, and some areas, have more because of historic industries or oil spills or things like that, where they would have, elevated heavy metals. So a lot of communities have had to deal with this problem and kind of work on bioremediation and like soil testing. So like we can learn a lot from those communities. I would say I am kind of following like California Department of Toxic Substances Control. They have safety standards for how much like metals in your soil is okay for human exposure, that, if you go beyond that, could increase your risk of cancer or chronic illness. And the EPA also has regional screening levels that also provide like safety standards. So like for lead, it's like 80 parts per million in soil. And so generally prior to the fire, when I've done lead testing in soil, your higher risk areas generally are like, if it's a parkway next to like a road that's really busy, has high vehicle traffic, that's generally more elevated in lead anyway. It could be like 100 parts per million. Next to an old house, we're using lead paint. It could also be like close to 100 parts per million. And, in more severely impacted cases, like it was like an auto shop or something, it could be even higher than that. So in certain places, like there's pre-existing like high levels of lead. And fortunately, from like the little bit of testing that I've done so far from in and around the burn areas, like currently it's been mostly around the Eaton fire, like the metal levels haven't necessarily like gone past that 80 parts per million. Only a couple spots, like somebody's front yard on North Pasadena was like 127. There was a burned down house in Altadena that was like 300 something. So that's very elevated, but that's to be kind of expected at a burn site. So, but I even did test some ash at another burn site and it wasn't like that high. So, and so that's what we've been seeing. Like most likely you would see high levels of heavy metals. And we're still waiting on results coming in for things like asbestos and PFAS and dioxins. We did get some PAH results and VOC results, and those weren't detected at those sites, but it's been a while since the fire started, so they may have dissipated already. The other thing I was concerned about was there's a webinar that Caltech put on that was really informative, and they show a map of the wind like blowing south and to the west. So I'm just maybe a little bit concerned that contaminants may have blown like further west. Yeah.
That was going to lead up. That's great, because that's leading up to my next question, because I personally live about 20 miles from the Palisades, a little bit more, like 20 miles from Santa Monica, 20 miles from the Eaton fires. And, you know, of course, there are people who are closer, who are a little further away. I had ash fallout dust on my car, because again, I don't know how to measure that, but on my car at the bottom of the windshield, I had anywhere up to a quarter to half an inch of the ash. And the question that I have myself and from other people, like how concerned, you know, I know part of it's a very individualized, you know, like if you have pre-existing health conditions and concerns and whatnot, but like UCNAR recently just put out a new kind of bulletin or fact sheet about what to do, and some of it's just recommending that if have ash fallout, you dig out 6 to 12 inches of your soil, but like it's still a very wide margin in my opinion, because when you're digging 6 inches of soil, it's a lot. It gets really heavy. 12 inches is even more, but like there's no guideline currently that I've seen that tells you how far you are and where you are, because we don't really know, right, how the wind patterns are blowing and where it's at. So how concerned do you think should someone be based on what ashes they may have and how much they might need to dig out from their soil if they're not going to immediately like try to deal with it versus some sort of bio or phyto or myco remediation efforts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I know a lot of people.
Phyto remediation, for folks who don't know, is using plants, and then myco is mushrooms and fungi.
Okay. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think other people are curious too, like how far out do you need to be to test the soil or the ash? And I have been prioritizing more in and around the burn areas. I did test some spots further away, like in Griffith Park and Glassell Park, and those haven't been like, the metals haven't been alarmingly high. There were no PAHs detected, so but it's hard to say, like, you know, without somebody going out and doing testing in all of these areas, like it's hard to say like where that material would be. Like there's maps about the wind and the air quality, so we could try to track like where was the air quality worse, you know, post fire, and potentially say like those areas maybe have more contaminant fallout, and test those soils. So I guess I would try to look at that. Also, just thinking about prioritizing the testing, like at the very least, you know, you could test for metals that might be like $80 to $100. And, you know, the PAHs, if we haven't really detected them, I assume they're not as big of a problem. So the other concern would be like asbestos. And that's a very inexpensive test just to see if it's there or not. It's like $15 or so just to see like, is it there or not? And there's more expensive tests to do quantitative analysis to see how much is there. So at the very least, you could do metals and asbestos. And then the other tests are like much more expensive in order to be able to really find out, like, you know, where did these contaminants spread to? Yeah.
So I think, you know, everyone's going to take the information that they learned or from all these like official agencies that as more information is coming up to decide like what to do in their garden. Like for me personally, I have some health stuff. I have an autoimmune disease and I have asthma. So my lungs know when the air is not good. Like today it's hurting a little bit. But again, I'm 20 miles. I did get away, and I did get ash fallout. So I have chosen thus far, since the fire started, not to eat any leafy greens from my garden. And again, that's based on my own knowledge and what I do know and what I heard from the official agencies and my own health. So, you know, folks decide based on your own situation too. But I've chosen not to consume any of my leafy vegetables, especially things like lettuce. Collard greens, I think I will, because it gets washed out. It's a little thicker. It's not as porous on the leaves. And the reason is because the leaves can absorb some of that stuff with the ash and whatnot. And recently we just had lots of heavy rain, so hopefully some of that stuff is kind of washed out. I am also going to choose, though, not to eat my beets because they're a root vegetable. They were in these very contained pots near my car where there's a lot of ash. So I'm kind of choosing not to eat those right now, and I might actually dig out some of that soil. And then also the leaves on the beets are very tender, and normally I eat those. So I'm not going to eat those. But I think I feel okay in my garden to eat everything else new that's going to grow. I did pull out some weeds. I have a lot of nasturtiums in my front yard, and we do eat those, and I do like ferment the pods. I did pull out some of the bigger and older vegetation. And I did, in terms of phytoremediation, what I've done is my chickens get buckwheat, okay? So I threw some buckwheat seeds down in my yard, and later when the plants grow, this is just ordinary buckwheat. We're not talking about native buckwheat, which is probably a better choice actually. But for my edible gardens, I just put that down because it's what I had, and I'm gonna pull it out later, the plants, and throw them away. Not in my compost, not in the greenways, because buckwheat, I'm hoping just as a whole genus can help pull out the toxins. Even there are studies, right, that California native buckwheat and some other plants like sunflowers and yarrow can help with the uptake of heavy metals. So that's what I'm choosing to do so far. What would you do if you were like maybe a little closer? I don't know, or and it's a very personal thing. So that's why we want to discuss it. And I don't want to tell anyone what to do, but I think people need to think about what they want to do and the information that's out there and decide for themselves. Also, definitely also look at official recommendations that are coming out, and UCANR and the LA Public Health Forum that they just had recently, the town hall, the experts did say it is safe to eat some of your veg and stuff, you know, and again, leafy things like lettuces, especially if you're closer, is probably not something you want to eat.
Yeah, I think the choices you're making are good. Like, you know, you're being cautious, and it is sad to be like, oh, this food that I grew, like, I can't eat, so I'm gonna have to start over again.
And it hurts because I don't like throwing my stuff in the green bin. I compost everything and give it to my chickens, and it hurt me to put it in my green bin. I was like, ah!
Yeah, it's really sad. And yeah, there's like different recommendations, different kind of thoughts about this. Like, one is that in the short term, the ash is not going to be a problem, and you should just wash it really thoroughly. Right. You could soak it in like a 10% vinegar solution. But as time passes, and if the ash is still in your soil, then, you know, the roots will start like taking up the metals. From what I read, they're not going to take up the other contaminants, but they could be stabilized in the root zone. So yeah, root vegetables might be like the most risky vegetable to eat right now. You know, if you haven't cleaned up your soil or you don't know. And I always just feel like thin skin, like porous leaves are also, you know, risky if they've, you know, had ash fallen onto them. I think like if you do want to eat those things, to take off the outer leaves, you know, just cut off the stem, like separate all of the leaves and like wash them really well, like several times, 3 or 4 times before you eat them. And fruits are probably going to be okay unless they're like super thin-skinned fruits.
Yeah, I totally ate my pomelos and my lemons.
Yeah, like the thick-skinned fruits are probably fine. Like they're not supposed to take up heavy metals anyway. And, you know, as long as you wash them well. And generally speaking, I would recommend like cleaning off the ash on your like trees and any existing plants, and maybe doing some good like compost tea applications. Yeah. So those good microbes will really help to protect your plants and also help degrade any contaminants or bind heavy metals also. But yeah, so root vegetables are probably the most risky. Like leafy greens, you have to just use your best judgment on that. And then fruits are probably okay. Unless it's, you know, if you have very thin skin like berries or something that got ash on them, that might be, you know, a risk. The other thing is like peeling your fruits. So if anything is on there, like the skin is going to have the most of it. So that would be another approach.
So, slight segue. Earlier, Lynn had asked me about chickens and eggs, and I have gotten that question from some people. I don't know the real answer, folks, but what I did when I was researching my book, and what I've kind of looked up is that there have been some studies, but not in the United States. They've been in like India and Italy, at least the ones I recall, on heavy metals in eggs, and they mostly come from feed that they buy, and they're so I'm not as concerned about that for my chickens. So I've been eating the eggs, haven't had an issue, but there was a couple of other studies where they tested heavy metals in an egg, and whether you cook it with the shell on or cook it like open in a frying pan, they found less heavy metals in eggs that did have some heavy metals in the eggs that were cooked without the shell, because a shell is porous also, and that's where some of it tends to get trapped. Again, I am not a chicken egg scientist by any means, but I felt safe with my chickens in their feed, and even with some of the ash that my chickens free range, they're going to eat some worms that may have the stuff and the bugs, but I feel okay about it. You know, it's a lower risk, and if your chickens have heavy metal poisoning, I've known people with cases of chickens with heavy metal poisoning because they accidentally ate a screw or something they weren't supposed to eat. You know when they're sick. So I think as long as your chickens look fine, you know, you can eat the eggs. And of course, if they look sick, be concerned, especially since right now we're dealing with another breakout of the highly pathogenic avian flu. But that's another issue. But I have not, in the same sense that, you know, when I talk to people about chickens and do consulting on that, I tell people you are what you eat, right? But you are also what you eat as well, especially since we're eating the eggs. So I have not been giving my chickens greens from the garden, at least the not more porous leafy greens. Like I will not be giving my chickens, like I said, if I'm not going to eat the beets or the beet greens, I'm not going to give it to them. I'm actually going to let them grow a little bit more so it looks pretty, and then throw it in my green bin, or actually the trash if I think there's a lot of heavy metals. And then the tree collars that I have, now that the rain's gone, I'm going to give them to the chickens. But during the first 2 weeks, the chickens have not had any of the greens from the gardens that they can't forage themselves on the hills. So they've been eating like the native toyon berries and stuff. But so that's the thing on chickens. So I want to talk about and ask you your opinions about biochar. A lot of people in gardens have been posting like, oh, we know biochar is great for the garden. It is. We know that biochar can accumulate and hold on to and take up heavy metals. It can. But my question is, because a lot of people are just not sure what to do in the next step. And some people, I think that just because it's good for the garden, they might just leave it in there. But my mind automatically just assumes that if the biochar is going to uptake the heavy metals, I probably shouldn't let it decompose and further release heavy metals later on. I mean, it's a months-long process, but would it be better to take out, and if you're going to put biochar down, scrape it off and then throw it in the trash? Or would you let it decompose, or is there some science that I'm missing and not understanding?
That's a good question. So biochar is like an empty sponge, kind of. It's just got a lot of pores in it, and that's why it's great for like nutrient storage and water storage and microbe storage. Um, so in the case of being able to filter out contaminants, and so as an empty sponge, you put it down, it's gonna kind of just absorb everything around it. And so if there's a lot of contaminants, that's great. Like it'll get absorbed by the biochar. And it has this ability to kind of enhance microbial activity because it's kind of providing that habitat. So if it's mixed in with compost, those microbes could potentially be enhanced through the biochar. And so potentially it could help degrade some of the contaminants. But in terms of like heavy metals, like, yeah, that's going to be bound up in the organic matter, in the biochar. And I think as long as you maintain that organic matter, but I'm a little bit uncertain like what that threshold is, like how much organic matter to like how much lead is going to be like bound up very well for a long time. So there's different strategies involved. Like if you have a lot of heavy metals, you probably want to remove that sequestered material, like whether it's biochar, whether it's plants, and unfortunately like put it in the landfill. Otherwise you'd have to probably pay like a private hazardous waste company to take it away. And yeah, there's not really like good solutions for that. So yeah, you kind of have to think about what you're trying to do in bioremediation. Like, are you trying to remove the heavy metals from your space, or are you just trying to make it like not bioavailable? And if you have a lot of heavy metals, it's probably better to remove like at least a significant amount of it, and then the remaining try to bind it up with like compost, biochar. There's also a mineral called zeolites, and there's a really cool community group called Prospering Backyards, and they've done a lot of research with zeolites, and they show that it's like a permanent sequestration of lead. Again, that's like looking at like what levels that you're dealing with and trying to find the right strategy for that. Yeah.
Zeolite is something people use in chicken keeping too, because it can help suppress their ammonia smells when people aren't really keeping their. If you're doing deep litter and you're doing it right, or keeping your coop clean, it shouldn't be too smelly and should decompose properly. But sometimes after a rain, you do get that more as ammonia smell. And I have purchased zeolite to sprinkle in the coop to kind of help with that, because ammonia, the gas, can be a little irritating and toxic. So sorry, slightly off topic.
That's cool.
So, my other plant, I do have some natives in the front yard, and I think if people are landscaping new or adding stuff, I would probably say it's a good idea to add more native plants. It's always good to add more native plants because that helps support a healthier ecosystem, right? And I generally recommend people, like, seriously, in the forest and nature, things don't grow in straight rows, in straight lines, so stop following that method. That's my philosophy, and farms do it that way because it's more economical for them and easier for them to pick. But in nature, things don't grow like that. And I feel like generally, if you let things grow a little wild and messy, like my front yard, which some of my neighbors hate, it's better for me, it's better for the ecosystem. And I think in terms of like helping with organic matter, especially if you do chop and drop, you're automatically adding organic matter that can help sequester some of the stuff and help balance out the soil, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like leaf litter is good to leave, on your soil. I would say you want to apply, and it's different. Like it's always good to kind of test to see like what level is there. But generally speaking, yeah, your leaf litter, your mulch, your compost, your biochar is all going to help sequester heavy metals. And it could just be that you just want to keep it sequestered there. Like people aren't really going to hang out there. Kids aren't really going to play there. And like, that's okay. So also just depends. I always also tell people, to prioritize their testing and bioremediation strategy based on how the space is used. So we prioritize like high traffic areas, or like children's like play areas or food growing areas. Like those are the spaces that we are more concerned about being more rigorous in cleaning up those spaces.
That's great. So I lost my train of thought for a second. Fungi. We talk about mycoremediation. I've gotten questions about that, and I tell people I don't really know a lot, but I do believe in, you do need mycelium and fungi activity in your soil for better health, soil health, and especially again if you see these things that look like fuzzy mold in your soil, that's good. You want that. And there's a lot of questions about mycoremediation. So do people buy mycorrhizae and sprinkle in their soil? My crazy idea is I took a small break this winter, but I have been picking up spent mushroom substrates from mushroom growers to add as compost and for litter in my coop, and to have super volunteer free mushrooms when I leave them alone. My plan is to take some of that and put it in my front yard where I grow most of my food, because chickens will eat my yard if I grow my food if I grow in the backyard, and just also then let the mushroom do the work. But of course I won't be eating the mushroom if I'm using them to try to clean up. Does it really matter? I guess my question is like, what type of mushrooms? I know it does, but like if people have limited access to kind of mycoremediation, it's still a newer science, right? So does it make a difference, and is my crazy plan worth the effort?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the spent mushroom substrate is cool. So those are typically going to be like edible and medicinal mushrooms.
Right.
So you have your like oysters and lion's mane and shiitakes.
Yeah.
I don't know, do they grow shiitakes on logs, or do they also use the substrate?
It depends on the mushroom grower. My guy, Hidden Pearl Mushrooms, he has been experimenting with growing shiitake in the substrates, in the special substrate, but it's very, very slow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and then there's like, I don't know, reishi and other medicinal mushrooms. So that's really interesting. I think that's good. Like you're kind of introducing those species, and they will help to accumulate heavy metals if the mycelium grows. I think it's always, good to also, have a little bit of carbon and nitrogen kind of food for them. So like the leaf litter or a little bit of compost also can help kind of encourage them to grow.
Right.
But yeah, so again, it's like if you wanted to remove it, like you want to have a way to like remove it. Like one method is like to do a sock and like put your compost mushroom substrate biochar in like a mesh sock, and then maybe dig it into your soil. So that way, like, after 6 months to a year, you could dig it out and remove it, and then know you've removed it from your landscape. So there's different options. So if you wanted to remove it, that would be, one way to do it. The other thing that I've been learning from like mycologists and some of my friends that I know, I've started a group called the Center for Applied Ecological Remediation, which is really based on Danielle Stevenson's work. She did her PhD at UC Riverside on bioremediation on brownfields in Los Angeles. And there's another group called Co-Renewal. They did some work on bioremediation after the campfire in Paradise. And so I've been learning from them about how it's important to try to introduce like native fungi and native soil as like an inoculum, and they can help sequester metals and break down contaminants. So this would be like going to like a non-fire impacted kind of wilderness area, collecting some soil. If you see mushrooms, you could collect the mushrooms. Or if there's like, tree bark with mushrooms, you could collect some of that bark and kind of like disperse it in your soil. So that's like another way to inoculate as well. And one of the principles just generally is like more biodiversity. So diverse like mushroom substrate, diverse kind of just native soils, all of those will help.
And I think it's important to point out again with the diversity, of course, if we're going to have an edible garden, it's going to be things that are not native, but I would always encourage, I do want to encourage people to plant more natives. And if you're looking up stuff on phytoremediation, I think it's important to note that we should not be planting stuff for bioremediation and phytoremediation that's not native. So for example, I looked up an article that was talking about cleaning up petroleum hydrocarbons, and they found poplar was a really good source in a tree and plant that has that great uptake of the petroleum hydrocarbons. But I don't think we should do that in Southern California or California at all, because that's not a native species to here, to this our state. But also in our region, I have people asking me like, well, what plants are good for, sequestering different toxins and stuff, and they're scattered information like, California black sage, the California sagebush, or Artemisia, it's not a sage, Artemisia californica, mugwort, buckwheat, yarrow, sunflower bush. But I didn't find, and maybe you'll know this, I didn't find a specific list listing all of those for Southern California. I did find one list from the California Plant Society chapter in San Francisco, and they had a list of different plants for San Francisco area though. Is there one for Southern California that's like compiled and sequestered in one area for people to look up that you know of?
I don't know specifically. I assume there's some that are out there. But yeah, I don't know specifically of like a consolidated resource like that. And yeah, it's a real opportunity and need for more like accessible like resources for the community to understand these concepts, like understand which plants, which species, which types of microbes, which amendments would be good to use for,
and what to do
purpose.
Afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know, hopefully that's something that can be created somehow out of this situation, because definitely people are really wanting to learn and understand. I have mostly just been going into research articles and just based on like things I've experimented with or like other people have experimented with. So I have like a list in my mind of like plants, like just like you had said. And there's research about native plants, and a lot of them are really good for stabilizing or picking up heavy metals and facilitating the native microbiology to break down contaminants. So so the native plants can do a lot, and so we should try to focus on using native plants. I also did see like an article about how eucalyptus is like good at taking up metals, but we don't want to be planting eucalyptus, so like you don't have to use it just because it does the thing. Right. Like there's like other things to consider. We want to take a more integrated perspective.
Yeah, and I think even if we're not finding a list, and I don't want to be the one to or have expertise to be creating that list, but even if we can't find it, I feel like there are a lot of information out there on how re-landscaping thoughtfully with natives can again help with fireproofing, create a fire barrier, and just again lend to the natural environment and ecosystem. So whether or not I feel like we know which plant does what, I think it is just a better choice to put those natives down on your property, replace things. My husband and I are saving up to remove our 3 large overgrown non-native and invasive ash trees and putting native oaks down. And we already have some toyon, and I've been propagating some elderberries, so I want to put them up there. So, I think things like that are a little bit more helpful for retaining soil, right? Securing slopes from mudslides after a rain and then fire. So either way, I feel like native plants are only a benefit, not a harm. Or just like you said, planting eucalyptus is not a solution here, even though all around this area that I live, there are tons of eucalyptus because that's what they planted, and yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Native plants are also tend to be more fire resistant. And I think that's just part of their adaptation and ecology. And actually a lot of trees have kind of withstood the fire and they kind of are like adapted to do that. Like they're adapted to withstand occasional fire. And I think a lot of people are concerned that they're a fire hazard, but you know, they hold water. You know, plants can respond to fire, they can perspire. So like a lot of people's fruit trees, like, were still standing after the fire. And so like I think trees can protect like our homes from fire. And so we want to think about, you know, using native plants and trees. And there's other things like cactus can work as like a fire break. So thinking about more fire resilient, climate resilient landscape design, but also building design. Like there's a lot of interest in like natural building now because that's like much more fireproof. And so it'd be great to find ways to make it easier for people to rebuild using natural materials or other fireproof materials.
I want to build one of those earth dome homes in like a little cob oven.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the many things I want to do, but don't have time for. I think the other thing is my question, or I guess what I'm choosing to do is my whole front yard, for those that don't know, is all natives, California natives, edibles, and medicinals, with the exception of a few non-native milkweeds because I'm a registered monarch way station. But I have also chosen not to use any of the leafy medicinal herbs and spices and stuff that I have right now, including flowers like calendula that are in season, just again because I did see a nice coating of ash on my stuff and I don't know what's in my soil right now. So I'm going to painfully choose to let them all go this season and then cut them out and then let them regrow. And again, that's my personal choice because I have certain health stuff that I'm a little concerned about. And when I give people things, I want to make sure I'm giving them things that are a little cleaner in my mind so that I don't cause other people potential endocrine or other problems. What is that? Am I going overboard, or do you think that's like something that people should be doing? Or I know it's a personal decision, but still.
Yeah, it's a good question. I want to say, like, if you're concerned about the ash contamination, like more thicker leaves or needles are probably more protected. So like herbs and leaves that are more thin,
so like your oregano's, thyme, and rosemary would be on the safe
like
side.
Rosemary is pretty thick,
Right.
so that might be safe. But yeah, if you have like dill or something that's very thin, so that could be more of a risk. Or I don't know, even like a sagebrush is very thin leaves, right. So I don't know, I would be concerned about that. And then more long term is like, you know, if you have left the ash in your soil, it's like the main risk is potentially pulling up heavy metals. So that's like the main risk. Other things are kind of going to be stabilized in the root zone and they're not going to take it up. So yeah.
So yeah, personal decisions. That's why we're talking about that. I think if I lived a little further and I didn't see so much ash fall, I wouldn't be as concerned at all. Especially, you know, but I am a little bit more just because of my health. Like my husband doesn't care about that stuff as much. He's a little healthier. We hope. Okay, I think that like answered most of my questions, and I know Ashley's not here, but she had some of the similar questions about like what she's been telling her clients and what some other clients who are closer to the fire zone, their questions were about their fires. About their gardens. So I would think that if you're in Sierra Madre or Pasadena, I think for me personally, if I lived in those areas and I had a food garden, I would be digging out the soil. Again, I'm further away, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to work on adding organic matter and doing some phyto and other bioremediation and my weird mushroom idea, you know? But yeah, in those areas, I think I would, and I have recommended to some people, like based on what I've been seeing and who I've been talking to, I would remove some of that soil personally, especially if you're eating from your garden a lot. Or just grow for fun for now and then pull all the plants out and throw them away.
Yeah, so one client I had, he had a vegetable bed. He had a lot of daikon growing in, and he was concerned about it. He was in like Pasadena, and it was like, okay, well, just let the daikon grow, and then once they're done, pull them out, throw them away. Just treat them like a phytoremediation plant at this point. So, you know, that's something you could do too as an approach. Is just like leave things in there just to be able to pull up the heavy metals. The most basic thing you could do is do the heavy metals test. Pull it all out. Maybe 6 months to a year. Take another one to see like how much has been removed. So, that's a way you could monitor over time. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's a good suggestion, especially if money is a barrier to getting a lot of tests done. The heavy metals, it's not super expensive, but you get a whole panel of major heavy metals, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lynn, for chatting with me. And I hope maybe some people can get more ideas about what they want to do personally in their homes, in their gardens. And hopefully we'll get more information from official channels, because things are just, we may not get all the answers, not even in 10 years, but just over time, there's a lot of people doing different studies on soil and plants and stuff. So hopefully we'll get more answers and we'll be better prepared when there's a next one.
Yeah.
I don't want to be overly like, oh, there's never going to be one, but the truth is it's going to happen again. So hopefully we're all a little bit more prepared.
Thank you for inviting me to this conversation and, helping to share this information and at least like get the conversation started and help people think about the different principles at play and just help us all make better decisions for ourselves.
And we get to learn a lot of new things, right? In talking like this.
Yeah.